Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Southeast Radio.
Welcome back to Southeast Radio's Business Matters with me, Karl Fitzpatrick. Well, I'm now joined on the line by a resident economist, Marc Coleman. Marc, just after the government's victory in relation to the eviction ban, the government's proposed reform of the planning system to accelerate home building was rejected as unworkable by the Irish Planning Institute. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts are, sometimes what looks like a victory can be a defeat, and sometimes what can be a defeat can be a victory. The victory on the eviction ban might lead the government to think that it's on the right course. And in theory, as an economist, I would say there's never any justification for an eviction ban when free markets are working properly and when there are alternative, affordable alternatives for people who are evicted. And that's why in other countries that I'm familiar with, like Germany and the Netherlands, it's not controversial to evict people because they will quickly find alternative accommodation. But in this country, we don't have that normality. So the eviction ban, while in theory every economist would say, yeah, get rid of it, in the context of Ireland's dysfunctional market, it isn't that simple, and that perhaps a closer vote might have caused the government to think a little bit more about that, whereas the defeat in relation to the planning might actually be a victory if it prompts the government to reconsider planning legislation that, while well-intended, is really just going to deliver more unaffordable BTRs, at 4,000, 5,000 rental a month that very few people can afford. And maybe the Irish Planning Institute has actually done the government a favour by saying, hang on a minute, you might actually be better off building in some consultation, listening to some signals now, and avoiding a lot more pain down the road. Can I just briefly tell you, Karl, about my own war-weary 20-year journey trying to encourage long-term thinking on housing? It started in the European Central Bank. Around about this time, 20 years ago, I delivered a paper to a conference of central bankers in Prague. And I said the big problem with housing investment and other public investment is that it's got a very stop-start quality, because when governments hit elections, they tend to spend on either current spending or tax cuts, and they tend to stall infrastructure. So the kind of long-term spending over 10, 20 years that you need for a growing country like Ireland, instead you get a stop-start mechanism. And I, a couple of months later, developed a paper on how we could reform the Stability and Growth Pact. You may remember, some of your listeners may remember the Stability Pact, which limits government borrowing. And I said that should only apply to current spending, because we should let growing countries like Ireland have the freedom to borrow for housing investment for growing populations. And that was also the case with the accession countries. You may remember that the new emerging, growing Eastern European countries had low debt and they needed infrastructure. They had rickety infrastructure from the communist era. So I said, if we put Ireland's housing need and the Eastern European countries' needs together, we have a strong case for giving governments that freedom. I have had people coming up to me from Italy, from China, from Germany, saying, look, we have solutions to your housing problem. We would love to come and help. And surely it's not beyond the wit of government to engage in international cooperation to solve those capacity issues. And I really feel that until all political parties sit around a table and recognize that this housing crisis can only be solved in a 10 or 20-year horizon, we're not going to solve it. And if you know and accept that it takes a 10 or 20-year horizon, you then realize that what's got to happen is a cross-party consensus. I know it goes against the grain of Irish politics. Many of your listeners will be old enough to remember the Tallaght strategy, when this country was going down the toilet very quickly in the mid-80s after a decade of disastrous government. The only way it was solved was by a political leader called Alan Dukes and a Fianna Fáil finance minister called Ray McSharry sitting down, cooperating. And it was that produced a virtuous circle between 87 and 97. For 10 years, we had fantastic growth. We restored full employment. And I strongly believe that it's that cooperation that we're going to have to resort to in the next 10 years to solve the housing crisis. Unfortunately, the more I look at the Oireachtas, the less I think that that's possible. But who knows? Maybe after the next election, the penny will drop. Let's see.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was a resident economist, Marc Coleman, and we look forward to hearing more of Marc's economic insights on next week's show.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.